My pleasure to welcome you to our Race in Hollywood Symposium. We're probably going to have a few people joining us here in mid-presentation, but we wanted to get started so we can maximize our use of the hour. So let me go ahead and move on here. This is a project, obviously, of the Bunche Center, and it's many years in the making. Shana Redmond, our assistant director, will be joining me to talk about some of the highlights of the project and what we've been doing over the last several years, actually. So with that, why don't we move on? So I think it's probably appropriate at this point to acknowledge some people, supporters of the project. Of course, Dr. Redmond, who has been very instrumental in the project over the years. Also, Zachary Price, who's a visiting researcher with us here at the center this year from UC Santa Barbara. Ambria Allen, Jonathan Collins, Marsha Fuentes, and Terrell Winder. All graduate students here at UCLA who've worked on the project in one capacity or another. Also want to acknowledge the Hollywood Advancement Project, which is the umbrella project for this particular report that we're going to be talking about today. It has been in existence for a number of years now and has benefited from the support of a number of entities, some of whom we can name and others we can't because of the nature of what we're doing. But we've garnered quite a bit of support from the industry itself. Certain entities within the industry who are interested in this topic, diversity in Hollywood, and we just want to acknowledge them anonymously, I guess, at this point. And last but not least, Shutterstock for some of the images that we're going to be using, and of course I took a few of the images as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the problem here. Well, the previous literature on Hollywood diversity shows pretty clearly that the industry is not very diverse, all right? And that goes for in front of the camera, in terms of actors and the roles that we see on the screen, as well as behind the camera, when we start talking about diverse talent as writers, producers, directors, and so forth. One of the areas we're also particularly interested in was talent agency representation, something that the literature talks about, although not consistently. There hasn't been a lot of work on this, but the work that has been done suggests that this is a very important part of the process, in the sense that the agencies tend to act as gatekeepers by packaging projects, particularly the larger projects, and at least the previous literature suggested that talent of color didn't gain a lot of traction within these agencies. That is to say, the rosters were pretty homogenous and mostly white and dominated by males. So we wanted to take a look at that as well as we tried to understand what was happening in the industry today as it relates to diversity. In addition to the previous research, which tends to be spotty, that is to say, there may be a report done one year by the Writers Guild, maybe another year by the Directors Guild, periodically by the Screen Actors Guild, or maybe advocacy groups like the NAACP who do a report called How to Focus, How to Sync, or maybe Children Now, another group that's more interested in children and images they see, or GLAAD that's interested in how gays and lesbians are portrayed. There isn't sort of a uniform, comprehensive, and regular source of data that gives us a sense of what's happening over time so that we can connect the dots and trace them over time. And that's what we're trying to do here with this study, is provide that comprehensive set of data. Now, the analytical dimensions we're interested in, first, of course, we're interested in access. This is an industry, and people are working. They're trying to get work. People of color are trying to be hired in front of and behind the camera, and they often hit brick walls or glass ceilings. They don't get hired in degrees, for the most part, that are commensurate with their share of the U.S. population. And that's kind of the standard we use. We're looking at kind of disparities between the share that people of color represent collectively as of the last census, about 36.3% of the U.S. population, compared to their shares of different arena employment within the industry. And so that's kind of what we observed throughout the report, is disjunctures between those two figures. So the first dimension is access. What's happening to diverse talent in their attempts to get work in the industry? How successful are they? The second dimension, in some ways, is more interesting, and certainly more interesting to me as a sociologist, And this is the whole issue of representations, that is to say the images that the industry creates, how those relate to what's actually going on in society, and how all of that plays into the way we think about ourselves, think about other people, judge what's real and what's not. There's a huge literature on the impact of media images and representations in terms of normalizing particular ways of looking at the world. And this literature basically suggests that particularly when we don't have immediate access to people or places or things, the images we get through media tend to have more influence on us in terms of how we think about those people, places, and things. So for sociologists and others who are interested in the role that media and images play in society, we want to know something about those images. So how they're produced, where they come from, how they're consumed, and what impact they might be having on things like racial politics or gender politics. And this is another dimension that we're very interested in this particular study. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ramon now to talk a little bit about the Hollywood Advancement Project so you can get a sense of kind of where it came from and what we're trying to do with it.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just on to we got the next slide here. Just to give you a little bit more background about how we entered into this arena, just wanted to give you some of that. Several years ago, the Bunche Center set out to study diversity or the lack thereof in the entertainment industry through studies and meetings with stakeholders around Hollywood. Through the information we gathered, we discovered the need for a comprehensive study that had not been conducted before that would examine diversity as Dr. Hunt discussed just a little short while ago. We also set out to explore the relationships between diversity and the bottom line. So we wanted to look at what, if people didn't care necessarily about diversity, maybe they would care about the economics of it and whether or not it would be profitable. So our Hollywood Advancement Project was born. It has three primary goals: to generate comprehensive research analysis of the inclusion of diverse groups in film and television, including lead roles, writing, directing, producing, and talent representation. And then second, to identify and disseminate best practices for increasing the pipeline of underrepresented groups into the Hollywood entertainment industry. And third, to consider the broader implications of diverse industry access and media images for society as a whole. So we have met with countless industry players, from top studio executives to first-year writers working, on various TV shows. And everyone has told us that they do see the need for this type of study, and especially the need for a connection to the bottom line. So the study that we started about a year and a half ago examined the race and ethnicity and gender of those employed in front of and behind the camera on TV and film during a particular season. So that's what we'll be discussing today, an overview of those findings. And if you would like to know a little bit more about what we found based on this presentation, we have a brief that is already out that we presented in October at the at the National Association for Minorities in Communication in Times Square. And so we released our preliminary findings there, and it's also on our website. But the probably the big news that you're all wanting to know more about is this full report that we're discussing today, and the full report will be available next Wednesday, February 12th, and we will release it on our website.
Okay, let me focus in a little bit more on some of the data that Dr. Ramon alluded to. First thing you should know about this particular study is that it's taking a snapshot of really 2011 and 2012. Just to kind of give you a little background, this is a very comprehensive study, meaning that we look at every single show on television, 1,061 TV shows. I bet you didn't know there were that many. But we're talking about shows across 60 cable networks and 6 broadcast networks. To my knowledge, no other study has done that. trying to look at what we're looking at. Typically, we'll look at the major networks, or we'll look at a couple of networks, or sample this or sample that. We're looking at everything that aired in a given year in terms of this whole question of employment access. Because of the nature of the data and the fact that our data set has to be complete, we have to wait till a year is over before we can start collecting and analyzing the data. So we're always about a year or so behind. That's why we're looking at 2011-12 as opposed to 2013-14 right now. And it's going to be that way every year. But our goal basically is to provide a snapshot of a given season every year, such that over time we can start connecting the dots longitudinally between the seasons and see what's really happening, whether or not there is change and the pace of the change, and if there is change, where is the change happening, and what appears to be driving the change. That's what we're interested in, all right? So for this particular data set, we looked at the top 172 films released in 2011. And by top, I mean top in terms of box office. Because again, as Dr. Ramon said, we're very interested in the relationship between diversity and the bottom line. And we looked at 1,061 TV shows from the 2011-12 season, 62 cable networks, and 6 broadcast networks. So what were some of the variables we were interested in? Well, we were interested in overall cast diversity. If we look at a particular cast of a TV show or a movie, what percentage of that particular cast was minority? Something we're very interested in. We were interested in, for television shows, the race of the creator. And there's a person who gets credited on every television show for being the creator of the show, which may or may not be the showrunner, the person who actually runs the show. But the importance of the creator is the basic concept for the show is established by this person. This person typically is involved in some type of pitch to a network or an agency that's packaging the deal. And all kinds of decisions about casting, about staffing, often flow from that basic idea. So the question is, what role do minorities have in that process? And I can tell you about some work I've done for the Writers Guild in the past that suggests that minorities don't play that big a role in that process, which can be thought of as the very beginning of the pipeline. And what we see on TV is kind of the end of the pipeline. All right? So we wanted to track that for all shows. We also wanted to know something about the gender of show creators. Because again, what we know from anecdotes and from past studies is that white males tend to dominate most of these very important positions. So we want to know something about women in that regard as well. We were also interested in show locations. Where are these shows being taped, filmed, etc., based on here. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Race and Hollywood Symposium. We're probably going to have a few people joining us here in mid-presentation, but we wanted to get started so we can maximize our use of the hour. So we go ahead and move on here. This is a project, obviously, of the Bunche Center, and it's many years in the making. And Shana Redmond, our assistant director, will be joining me to talk about some of the highlights of the project and what we've been doing over the last several years, actually. So with that, why don't we move on? Film, the role of the director is quite different than it is in television. The director is really the creative force behind the way the project comes together. And television, the director is more or less carrying out kind of an idea that the showrunner and others may have about a particular show. And often the directors on TV shows vary from episode to episode. That's something we track. So we counted literally the number of episodes that are directed by minorities. Now the Directors Guild does a study like this, but they only do it periodically, and they tend to only look at the top 40 primetime shows. We looked at everything on cable, broadcast, and have a much larger data set than they have to kind of get at this particular issue. We were interested in director gender for the same reason. We also looked at genres. Which genres are more popular today, and how do representation of different groups vary by genre over time? This is something that we don't know that much about, but over time, as we collect data from year to year, we'll know more about it. Continuing with variables, talent agency representation. What do the rosters of the talent agencies look like in terms of lead actors in films, or lead actors on television shows, or show creators, or directors, or writers in film? These are all questions that we examined, and we can kind of speak to some of the anecdotes about the absence of people of color in those positions. We also were interested in Oscar and Emmy Awards. Why? Not just because of the programming in the shows, but because of I guess the status that is accorded to certain types of productions, film and television shows, based on their garnering of these types of awards. One of the arguments we make, and I'll come back to this at the end, is that this process kind of awarding Oscars and Emmys to certain types of shows tends to reinforce the perception of what's quality and who's qualified to do certain types of things, which may have an impact on the exclusion of people of color and women in television and film. We'll get back to that. And last but not least, we look at a number of measures to get at the bottom line. In television, of course, Nielsen ratings, which determine essentially how many viewers are watching the show. Television, of course, is all about the commercials and about networks trying to sell their viewers' eyeballs to advertisers who are trying to sell to those people certain products. So the higher the rating, all things equal, the more profitable, or the higher the potential for profitability for a given show. So we wanted to track that as it relates to diversity. And of course, in film, global and domestic box office, and return on investment, which factors in the budget for the film. Because some films have a higher return on investment. They may not make quite as much at the box office, but maybe they return more because the budget was so low. And we wanted to see how that differed between films that were diverse in terms of the casting versus those that were more homogenous and typically white male dominated. So those are the basic variables that we looked at, and we'll talk about some of the basic findings that we had in a few moments coming out of those.
Okay, so before we get into the findings, we just want to give you some background on the Hollywood landscape itself. And so by far, Hollywood and the film industry continues to be the dominant form of entertainment, drawing more ticket admissions than theme parks and professional sports combined, as movie-going audiences continue to become more diverse. So according to the Motion Picture Association of America, or MPAA, as people may know it, the global film box office steadily increased from 2008 to 2012. Ticket sales continue to be driven by frequent moviegoers who attend once a month or more. Broader moviegoer demographic shares remained relatively stable from 2011 to 2012, with 12 to 24-year-olds and Latinos continuing to oversample in moviegoing versus their proportion in the population. However, 2012 saw increases in the number of frequent moviegoers in nearly every ethnicity and age group, most notably in the 40 to 49-year-old group. So when we look at TV, we find that consumers have many more entertainment options today than ever before. Besides going to movie theaters, people can watch all types of digital entertainment wherever they are, as you all know. At home, people are not tied to their TV sets. But although there are competing platforms, TV continues to be the top medium through which people view programming in the U.S., according to a 2012 report by the TV Bureau of Advertising. So with 97% of U.S. households owning a TV set, TV reaches more adults each day than any other medium, including the internet and radio. Adults also spend more hours watching TV than any other medium. So people can measure, the amount of hours you watch and the amount of households that have TV, but definitely the number of hours adults actually spend more time watching TV. However, viewing the data for 13 to 17-year-olds shows that these trends may be changing in the years to come. For example, TV reaches 13 to 17-year-olds almost at the same rate as the internet. So although youth still watch TV more than any other medium, they watch TV for fewer hours than adults do. So this is a share of the market that clearly needs to be watched in the years to come. So although 90% of households have cable TV, no cable network exceeds 40% reach in an average week. Broadcast networks still have more, and most even double the reach of cable TV networks. However, things may be changing as well in terms of broadcast versus cable. And so to stay profitable overall, the television industry has to continuously evolve to meet the needs of its consumers. Not only can people watch TV shows on different devices outside of the home, they can also watch it at their leisure with their digital video recorders or DVRs and through online streaming. So now that there are more cable networks that are producing more original programming, this adds to the competition for viewers. In addition, broadcast and cable networks, as many of you are familiar, have to compete with original programming from other sources that are not on TV, such as YouTube, Hulu, Netflix, and Amazon.com.
Okay, so I'm going to spend just a minute or two overviewing some of the basic findings that came out of this particular report, the first in our series. The first, as you might have gathered from the title, Making Sense of the Disconnect, is this idea of disconnect. And what do I mean by that? Well, on the first hand, underrepresentation is the norm. If we look at pretty much every arena in the industry, if we look at lead roles in film and television, if we look at directors, if we look at writers, if we look at talent agency representation, in every arena, we see that women and minorities are underrepresented. The only issue is the degree of underrepresentation, and it varies from marginal to extreme. In some cases, the degree of underrepresentation is so extreme that it's quite amazing. And one example that I can share with you is women in film as directors. The numbers are just absolutely abysmal. It's bad for minorities, and it varies by ethnic group. I mean, we focus on the report on minorities as a block because we're really interested in that basic number as it relates to what's happening in society. But if you look at the individual groups, there's some differences there as well. It's not good for anyone, but it's much worse for certain groups. So Native Americans are virtually invisible. You don't see them anywhere for the most part. Latinos are probably the most underrepresented, relative to their numbers in the population. African Americans have it best, so to speak, in terms of their numbers, but even that is a relative claim, given the fact that every one of the groups is underrepresented. And that's not even considering the quality of the roles, which is a whole other dimension that this particular study doesn't get into, but our future ones will when we'll be doing content analyses of the actual programming, where we start looking at, okay, what is the role, what is the content of the role, and how does that vary by gender, race, and so forth and so on. So the major finding in this report is this big degree of underrepresentation that basically is the norm, and the degree just varies. The disconnect comes in where we also find in our study that, lo and behold, movies and TV shows with more diverse casts tend to do better in terms of ratings and box office. So you might be thinking, okay, well, the industry is a business, right? And as a business, the goal should be to try to increase profits, which include box office and ratings. And if we kind of see that diverse casts lead to more box office and ratings, why don't we see more diverse casts? It's sort of like a puzzle, trying to figure out why it is we see this disconnect. Which brings me to the way we wrap up the report, this whole idea of making sense of the disconnect. So how can we explain this apparent paradox, I guess, between, on the one hand, what we see in terms of industry diversity or the lack thereof, and what's becoming clear about the importance of diversity, which only makes sense if you think about what's happening to this country demographically. I mean, right now, in 2010, the minority share was 36.3%. It's higher now. And of course, by 2042, whites will no longer be the majority. And in fact, by the end of 2014, they will no longer be the majority in California. They're already in the minority in Los Angeles, where Hollywood is located, but the trend is clearly in that direction, which means that markets are moving in the direction of being more diverse. And we already know from Dr. Ramon's earlier presentation that minorities tend to consume more media. They tend to be more likely to be frequent moviegoers, who account for the largest share of the box office. And they also tend to be heavy viewers of television. They watch more TV than other groups. So you would think, for all these reasons, the trends and the demographic data all suggest that, well, this is the reality. This is where things are moving. So why aren't we seeing this reflected in what the industry is producing? Well, here are some of the reasons that, that we believe drive this disconnect here. And hopefully, over time, as we document this process more, we'll begin to break up kind of this tendency, I guess, within the industry. Well, the first thing we have to realize is that Hollywood is an incredibly high-stakes industry, right? We're talking about huge productions in terms of dollars, and we're talking about multinational corporations controlling the industry and in a way that's very much focused on the bottom line. So people who do get a shot at making a project do everything they can to make sure, or at least as much as they can, that the project will be successful. Which means that they're not going to take risks for the most part. They're going to tend to surround themselves with people who think like them, who share their tastes or whatever, their sense of what's successful. And if you're already starting with an industry that's dominated by white males, that's pretty much guaranteeing that the people they're going to surround themselves with are also white males. So you're kind of reproducing white male dominance in the industry because of this pressure to kind of produce certain types of projects. Moreover, the people who are in the decision-making positions in the networks, for the most part, are also white males who are judging the possibilities and the value and the merit of different projects on the basis of their background and sentiments and what has worked in the past. Again, the past, which is not the future, which is where things are going. So you have this whole issue of comfort zone, which kind of makes it really hard to turn the battleship around in terms of the way people make decisions in the industry. You also have this thing called the small pool argument. There's this idea that there just isn't that much minority talent out there, it's unfortunate because we would love to hire them if they were there, in terms of talent. I mean, remember the whole Saturday Night Live debate recently about them having a hard time finding a black woman to be on the show, so they had black men dressed up in drag to kind of make up for the fact no black women on the show. And they've only had a few over the 35-year history of the show or 40-year history of the show, whatever it is. And this is an example of that small pool argument. I mean, clearly there are an infinite supply of extremely talented black comedians who could be on that show and do a great job, but the white men who run the show aren't tapped into that, that pool. It's not that important to them. They're more focused on the other things, and so we've sort of endured their absence ever since Maya Rudolph left the show, years ago. And with the occasional black woman who hosts the show, who then plays all the roles of them. But that's kind of an example, a specific example of kind of what happens at the macro level within the industry as it relates to this small pool argument. There just aren't that many of them. Meanwhile, you have the Oscars and the Emmys who reproduce and reinforce this idea. Because, of course, you're starting with an industry that already has a third of people of color, and so it's likely that the people who win the awards are not going to be people of color. And so you kind of create the image that, well, if it's good, if it's of high quality, it's this type of story, it's this type of writer, it's this type of TV show, it's this type of movie, which, for the most part excludes the types of movies, shows, and ideas that people of color, in those rare instances when they can make them, produce. And so it becomes this vicious cycle. They kind of, there aren't that many people who are talented, so we have to create these training programs, we have to showcase opportunities and all these other things to find this talent or to develop this talent. And it really becomes like a lottery system where you give like one or two people a shot, every year or every other year. And when you look at the numbers again 10 years later, nothing has really changed. I mean, it's more or less, we're actually falling further behind because the nation is getting more diverse as Hollywood gets, marginally more diverse. I mean, obviously Hollywood 2014 is not Hollywood 1950. There have been improvements. We all know about the year of black film this year, for example. But what has the nation done? The nation has become much more diverse than Hollywood has, so the gap has gotten bigger. And that's one of the things that we're trying to document. And so I guess our conclusion is that the disconnect does not bode well for the industry. I mean, the industry is going to have to deal with this at some point in a meaningful way. There's a lot of runaway production, but there's also runaway talent. There's a lot of talent of color who've left the industry altogether, who've moved to places like Atlanta. They've started up boutique industries. They've done online programming and other things to make up for the fact that there just aren't the opportunities in the industry to produce and tell the stories they want to tell. Okay, so with that, I will turn it over to our colleague, Dr. Zachary Price, who's going to talk about a case study that is related to this particular study and some of the findings that come from the study that involves a couple of films. Right?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I just want to say thank you to Dr. Hunt and Dr. Ramon for inviting me to be part of this project. I think as someone who's worked in the film industry and kind of knows these things, experienced these things firsthand, I can say that it's very important to have this kind of quantitative analysis. But for my talk right now, I'm going to move more into kind of a qualitative analysis or a hybrid thereof, using Django Unchained and 12 Years a Slave. Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained 2012 opens much in the same way that Steve McQueen's 12 Years a Slave 2013 closes. Each protagonist, Django, played by Jamie Foxx, and Solomon Northup, played by Chiwetel Ejiofor, are seemingly released from bondage within the antebellum South by white men who, while not ostensibly abolitionists, are certainly sympathetic to each character's situation. Tarantino's story begins in the still of the night in 1858 in Texas, as two slave traders who go by the name of the Speck Brothers make their way through the darkness on horses, followed with their chattel in tow, when they are confronted by an odd character, Dr. King Schultz, played by Christopher Waltz, who insists on purchasing their slave, Django. Now, we later find out that Schultz is in the business of bounty hunting on behalf of a judge in Austin, and Django is in fact the only individual who can positively identify Schultz's next bounty. A trio of overseers who formerly whipped, scarred, and then sold Django and his wife to separate plantations. Thus, when Schultz guns down the Speck Brothers after their refusal to sell Django, he is acting out of a pure economic interest. For Schultz, Django is a profit motive, a profit incentive. He states, quote, "On the one hand, I despise slavery. And again, on the other hand, I need your help. If you're not in a position to refuse, then all the better. So for the time being, I'm going to make this slavery malarkey work to my benefit. Still, having said that, I feel guilty. So I would like the two of us to enter into an agreement," end quote. The agreement is for Django to assist Schultz in capturing his bounty, for which Django will then receive not only $25 per bounty, but also Schultz will give the slave his freedom. And this begins Django's journey into an improbable and fantastical world of violence to fulfill what we refer to in theater and film as his super objective. That is to rescue his German-speaking wife, played by Kerry Washington, in a scene that culminates in fireworks when Django literally explodes the Candyland plantation, destroying the antagonist of the film, the loyal slave Stephen, played by the loyal Tarantino collaborator Samuel L. Jackson. While we see, on the other hand, Northup, a formerly free New Yorker, make several attempts to escape bondage on his own after having been kidnapped and then sold into slavery by white slavers, McQueen's epic 12 Years ends in 1853, with Northup leaving behind the repeatedly brutalized and raped Patsy, played by Lupita Nyong'o, in the dirt road, begging for him not to forget her. Northup is finally, for the lack of a better word, rescued from the Louisiana plantation by former friends from New York, who, after having received word of his location vis-a-vis a sympathetic Canadian played by Brad Pitt. Yes. Comes to the plantation alongside a marshal to retrieve Northup and return him to his family in New York. Now, Django and 12 Years demand that their audiences consume an incredible amount of violence. And audiences have responded at the box office. According to the Hollywood Reporter, Django had an estimated budget of $87 million and has grossed approximately $163 million domestic, $263 million foreign, and for a total of almost $500 million. And of course, this does not include DVD and cable sales, which are hidden profits for studios and investors, of which the statistics, unfortunately, are not available to the public. According to Box Office Mojo, and these numbers are current as of this week, the last time I checked, 12 Years a Slave costs less than half at the production value of $22 million, and has nearly doubled its return at approximately $46 million. And in terms of its foreign return, has also doubled at almost $51 million, giving it a total return of almost $97 million worldwide. And so some questions emerge when thinking about this. What is it that makes these films so successful? Does the viewing of the black body laboring in a particular kind of way reveal a desire for U.S. audiences to gaze upon black flesh in a particular historical context? What is the sociology that makes it acceptable for audience to see and consume narratives about slavery? Why is it happening now? What does cinema do? And what does cinema make, i.e. produce, specifically with regards to the economies within these particular narratives? And what can be said of the fact that with a film like 12 Years a Slave, a project so particular and so specific to the African American experience, a black British director was chosen, as well as an overwhelming black British cast. Now, if you think back to Schultz's statement, which I read to you earlier before, the statement reveals what I would consider a white anxiety, not only about slavery and its legacy for contemporary audiences, but also simultaneous Negrophobia, as well as desire for the black body, which cannot be untangled from the race-creating system, which is the foundation of U.S. capitalism. The race-creating system of disavowal and desire is perpetuated through what Cedric Robinson refers to as the racial regime, and has continued to persist into the 21st century based on previous productions of the antebellum South. Robinson writes, quote, "Racial regimes are constructed social systems in which race is proposed as a justification for the relations of power. While necessarily articulated with accruals of power, the covering conceit of a racial regime is a makeshift patchwork masquerading as memory and the immutable. Nevertheless, racial regimes do possess history, that is, discernible origins and mechanisms of assembly," end quote. Racial regimes construct themselves through the cinema, and of course Django and 12 Years are representative of the makeshift patchwork which masquerades as memory in order to maintain relationships of power. They are part of a constructed history, which, as Donald Vogel demonstrates in the seminal text, Toms, Coons, Mulattoes, Mammies, and Bucks, an interpretive history of blacks in American film, began with the depictions of slavery as early as Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1903, and were further amplified in Griffith's Births of a Nation, 1915, which was a white supremacist argument and justification for Jim Crow as well as lynching. Thus, the U.S. is constantly haunted by the first images of blackness on the screen by white actors performing in blackface. Later attempts at depicting slavery on the screen were followed by successful box office returns such as Gone with the Wind, 1939, Glory, 1989, and Amistad, 1997, all of which provided black talent with labor as well as accolades for studios from the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences to validate, and as we suggested earlier, legitimize these productions. Vogel adds commentary to the history of each of these films. In the case of Hattie McDaniel's performance in Gone with the Wind, Vogel suggests that the black servants of the Hollywood films of the 1930s met the demands of their times through incredible antics, unbelievable dialects, and their amazing absurdities. Servants were a marvelous relief from the harsh financial realities of the 1930s, Depression era, by adding buoyancy and jocularity to their screen appearances. However, with Gone with the Wind, Vogel writes, quote, "McDaniel's Mammy becomes an all-seeing, all-hearing, all-knowing commentator and observer. She remarks, she annotates, she makes asides, she always opinionizes. In Gone with the Wind, her mammy had brought to light a fact that white audiences had long ignored or suppressed. Here was a black maid who not only was capable of running the big house, but proclaimed in her own contorted way her brand of black power, end quote. McDaniels was awarded the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress for her performance and became the first African American to win the Academy Award. The film Glory brought attention to the story of the 54th Regiment, the 1st Black Infantry in the North during the Civil War. However, the film turned much of its attention toward the young white officer, Robert Gold, played by Matthew Broderick, Robert Gold Shaw, emphasizing Shaw's maturation and abolitionist posture toward slavery. As Bogle suggests, it also bore the, quote, mark of well-intentioned filmmakers who still felt the need for inbuilt safeguards and points of identification for a large white audience, end quote. As a counterpoint to the reticent Rawlins, Morgan Freeman, an older philosophical gravedigger, Tripp, played by Denzel Washington, having experienced the hardships of slavery, embodies a candid, outspoken abolitionist attitude. Glory climaxes with the Battle of Fort Wagner in Charleston Harbor, in which the members of the regiment fight for a freedom that they never really actually had. And in a scene in which the majority of the regiment perishes, as Washington's character leads a charge to end the film on a note of heroism, and I would also argue a note of nationalism, we are invited to believe in the Union's commitment to democracy for all. Glory took 5 awards, including Washington's Best Actor in a Supporting Role. Similarly, similar to the historically specific 12 Years, Steven Spielberg's 1997 Amistad was based on the true story of the 1839 rebellion of 53 West Africans on the Spanish slave ship La Amistad, and the trial of the Africans that went to the Supreme Court. However, as Bogle suggests, quote, rather than focus on the slaves themselves, the film was quick to record the valiant efforts of a white attorney played by Matthew McConaughey, as well as those of former President of the United States John Quincy Adams, played by Anthony Hopkins, to free the men. Though Morgan Freeman played a free-thinking abolitionist, the film gave him too little to do. Too often he just seemed to be hanging around. As the leader of the revolt, Cinque, played by Jumon Hansu, was a striking presence, strong, virile, quick to take action. But the script never reveals the depth of torment of this Sierra Leone rice farmer, a husband and a father who had been kidnapped and thrown into chains, end quote. The studios were simply not going to finance such a multi-million-dollar production for an African-American filmmaker. The film racked up 3 Academy Awards, including a Best Supporting Actor for Anthony Hopkins. And most importantly, it solidified the career of the Beninese actor Djimon Hounsou. Django and 12 Years, thus, are very much part of an intertextual genealogy of images rooted in a cinematic history of negative stereotype, disavowal, and or placation to socially progressive audiences, without ever challenging the dominant white discourse, either on the screen or at the box office. And so it's through using Django Unchained and 12 Years that this article, or my current research, rehearses a sociology of slave cinema as unique sites of labor in which black bodies are organized as commodities to perform cultural memories of trauma on the screen, while simultaneously performing grammars of suffering as cultural workers under the rubric of U.S. capitalism within the Hollywood film industry. Through these diegetic experiences, we witness a paradoxical tension between black participation within the Hollywood apparatus, which affords employment to black talent, i.e. actors, writers, directors, and an almost return to plantation-like ghettoization of laborers and objects within an industry which continues to propagate whiteness as the norm. And so it is in this context that Django and 12 Years are representative of both the political and libidinal economies produced through cinema. On the one hand, they are sources of labor in which unions, guilds, agencies, and a multi-million-dollar Hollywood network have been part of an economic order which has historically marginalized black talent, despite the contrary neoliberal echoes of a colorblind and egalitarian gendered industry. As the Bunche Center's Race in Hollywood report quantitatively demonstrates, that is simply not the case. Django and 12 Years are representative of an uncontested symbolic order in which the affinity for white aesthetics continues to structure the racial regime, reproducing hegemonic normative codes of white supremacy. In fact, the box office is the manifestation of the recursive production of discursive formations embodied through the propagation of the regime itself, lest it be revealed as the on which in their exhibition. This sympathy discoverable history is incompatible with a racial regime, and from the realization that paradoxically the authority and the other saps the vitality of racial regimes, end quote. The genealogy of the aforementioned images have very real implications for the lived experiences of black folk beyond those within the immediate scope of the film industry. As French philosopher and film theorist Deleuze suggested, the philosopher invents concepts which rely upon previous production of other concepts, just as the filmmaker, director, creator relies upon the ideologies embedded in the previous images of other filmmakers to create the blocks of movement images and time images, that is, the perceptions, actions, and affects, as well as the taxonomy of signs as the order of time and the order of things. Thus, in many ways, audiences have already been primed and prepped to consume the slave as object, and in 2012-2013, consuming slave cinema proved incredibly profitable. Of course, trying to understand or read or filter the condition of the black within the Western epistemological experience through the lens of a Deleuze or a Lacan or any kind of post-structuralist film theory as the point of departure is problematic, because so rarely do they take into consideration the state of crisis that the black artist, intellectual, and in this case, filmmaker finds themselves. And it is in this state of crisis which we need to then explore to understand what is the condition and the position of the slave within Western cinema. Thus, we must turn to someone like Frank Wilderson, whose work, Red, White, and Black Cinema and the Structure of U.S. Antagonisms, draws upon people like Frantz Fanon, Saidiya Hartman, and Orlando Patterson's work to demonstrate the very problem with attempting to frame, and by frame I mean situate, an ontology of the slave on the screen. In particular, Patterson's work is important to understand the unique power schema that these two films attempt to address. As Patterson writes, quote, "Slavery is the permanent, violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons," end quote. To understand slaves as merely property is to fall short of understanding the idiom of power, which is, quote, "the principal way in which power is immediately interpreted in socially and cognitively acceptable terms. It is the way in which power is most meaningfully presented to and understood by those who wield it and by the members in their community," end quote. The idiom of power exists at two polar extremes, personalistic and materialistic, and it is within the institution of slavery that these polarities then converge or collapse, relegating the slave as simultaneously an outsider as well as the enemy within, who is what Patterson suggests as socially dead. The socially dead slave also allows for solidarity between master and non-slave as, quote, "honorable members of their community vis-a-vis a dishonored slave," end quote. This is what Wilderson means when he refers to the contingency of violence, which is what holds civil society together, the world of the living, and a matrix of gratuitous violence which places the slave, and in this case the black, outside of civil society through a structural antagonism. This violence is gratuitous not only because it is recursive, but also because it is unprovoked, i.e., he did not shoot me because I was political or because I was demonstrating, but he shot me because I was black. This is not an economic violence per se, but a racial violence which maintains economic order and the racial regime. For Wilderson, it is this violence which denies the slave a voice, and this absence of a voice is a non-ontological condition which prevents the slave from truly being framed within the libidinal economy of the screen. Rather, the black body in Django in 12 Years is still a fungible object. Despite Tarantino and McQueen's laboring to convince us otherwise, These films ask us to suspend our disbelief and buy into a world where Django and Northrop can be actually manumission whenever it is convenient for civil society to do so. Since neither of these films contest the institution of slavery through revolt, Django is driven to save his wife, and at the end of the film, the most important individual for him to kill is Samuel L. Jackson, and Northrop is more determined to survive than revolt. The world that we are purchasing is, I believe, a reification of colorblindness. It is a reification of the symbolic order expressed at the box office through capital and rewarded through the self-fulfilling accolade system. While these films are profitable for their producers and the black talent which participate in their production, to be truly manumission, at least in the eyes of someone like Frantz Fanon, and certainly in the eyes of Wilderson, would require fulfilling an excess lack, which neither of these films are willing to do, because it would mean the implosion of civil society and thus the implosion of the film and entertainment industry as we know it. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I know we're a little tight on time, but we wanted to open up for any questions that people might have.
Yes. Well,
Yes.
this isn't really a question so much. Well, I guess there's a question involved in the last one. Okay, so much of that is so wrong and how many other slaves went off and wrote their own stories that we now can look at and go, wow, this is really terrible what they went through. And what happened in Solomon Northup's, his book was actually verified in a 1968 edition of the book. So, the salient facts were verified.
Right.
And he didn't rise up and kill his master, and that sucks that didn't happen. And we all, I'm sure, would hope that he had been able to do that, but that's not what happened. And the story focuses on him and what happened to him and what happened in his book. And so none of the stuff that you want to happen happened because it just didn't happen. And so and you're undermining his agency by saying that, oh, it didn't, the story wasn't showing, the slaves rising up and, killing their masters or rising up and revolting. And that's just ridiculous because that's not what happened in the book and that's not what happened in his story. And as for the Quentin Tarantino movie, it's freaking Quentin Tarantino. Of course it's freaking violent. Every movie he does is violent. And I know, I don't want to talk about the whole him at the end killing Samuel L. Jackson because, that was sort of messed up. And I like Samuel L. Jackson a lot. But you have to dismiss the whole, the gratuitous violence part because, you have to take into account that it's Quentin Tarantino. And that's just a ridiculous argument to even bring into it, unless you're also looking at every other single movie that he ever does. And not to mention, Quentin Tarantino has said that he actually did extensively research slave plantations. So, obviously, if you take out his, brand of how he portrays reality, and you look at the core stuff, he did try to bring some reality into what he represented. But as for your whole Solomon Northup, that's just completely wrong and off, and I completely disagree with you there. And I will bring in evidence too. I have evidence right here. I was looking it up.
Oh, okay. Exactly. You wanna
Well, first of all, thank you for your comment. I guess I don't think it's really a question. I don't necessarily know if it's an issue of wrong or right. I don't think I'm making a value judgment of either of these directors per se, either McQueen or Tarantino. In fact, I'm again looking at the way in which these films are operating in terms of their consumption, okay, and also why are these films so popular now? So these are questions that I'm raising. I'm not making a value judgment on these films. I don't think I ever said that. I don't think I ever said that they were good films or bad films per se. But I do think, first of all, you're right. You were absolutely right when you said that Solomon Northup, the story of Solomon Northup is based on a historical figure, though you are perhaps missing some of it. John Ridley, the screenwriter, that we had an opportunity to speak with actually at the screening at CAA, did take some license in creating characters within that film. So anytime you have a transition from one medium like literature, the written text, into film, there is going to be a shift and a transition in terms of what gets picked up, what gets left out, what gets heightened, and what gets downplayed. But again, I hope that you will definitely get in touch with me with your analysis, because I think that's something that I can ultimately incorporate into my my own research. So thank you so much for your
Oh,
comment.
well, I've done a lot of posts on Tumblr about women of color, and men in color. I've actually posted about like the numbers and how many women of color there actually are on the major networks.
Yeah, you know, it's not so much, you know, just to kind of echo the point that Zachary was making. I guess our goal is not so much to critique individual directors or individual projects per se. We're trying to understand how the industry operates as a regime and how that's related to factors like race, gender, and all these other things that circulate in society. And one way of understanding that, of course, is looking at how things are consumed, what makes it to the marketplace, and what happens to them when they get there. I guess the parallel in television, we have to go back a few years, but you think about Roots as a series that was incredibly popular, that you know, broke all kinds of viewership records when it was aired. It was also based on a true story, although again, we know that there was some license taken with the way the basic Haley's, you know, autobiography or family's autobiography or whatever was sort of transferred from the book to the screen. There was also some questions about the biography itself, about, you know, the book. But the point is, why did it become the big spectacle that it became? And what were some of the decisions made in terms of production along the way? Well, we happen to know a lot about that, and there's been a lot written about that. And the white producer who was responsible for the show had all kinds of rules of thumb that led him to make decisions about who was going to portray the various characters, how the characters were going to be fleshed out, what was going to make it to the screen, what wasn't, and so forth and so on, to make it marketable, to make it appeal to a particular audience, which at that point, of course, was largely white, you know, at least in terms of making the rating they wanted to get. So that's what we're talking about. Not so much, you know, saying that that movie shouldn't have been made, or, you know, or it shouldn't be acknowledged as, you know, a great film relative to everything that was out. It's really more about what it tells us about the way the industry operates and how that's connected to things like race and gender in society.
Well, I know that's not what you were talking about. I was just trying to, you know,
Sure.
back up the film because I thought it was a great film and that, you know, there shouldn't be, oh, he should have fought up, rose it up, and enslaved people, and that's not what happened.
And I guess, you know, I mean, we talk about this on TV all the time too. If these types of films weren't so few and far between, we wouldn't be holding every film up to this high standard of trying to accomplish everything. But the reality of it is that there aren't that many films like that. And so when there's one film and it doesn't kind of hit all the points, we're likely to be a lot more critical of it than we would be otherwise if there was, I guess, a greater range of diversity within different experiences shown. Yes?
Okay, please forgive me if you said exactly this, but considering like cycles of black filmmaking, like if you go blaxploitation or like ghetto-centric films in the 90s, and then the current, if you want to call it a trend, looking at films that talk about oppression and prejudice, going beyond slave narrative, also talking about films like Fruitvale Station and Help and things like that. The one thing that's in common is that these films are being made on a lower budget with these higher returns. And for studios to make, it doesn't matter how much they made as long as, it's kind of like the percent ratio to the return, you know what I mean? It's not like, oh, we made $400 million on Django, but we only made $100 million on 12 Years a Slave. Those are both hits for both of them in the grand scheme of things, if you look at the relationship budget. Would you say that this is just a continuation of that cycle? Like this is studio's way of responding to like the fact that there is such a there's such a hunger for these type of films. Would this be considered in the same vein as those other film cycles, just in more of a positive direction? So we're talking about prejudice and oppression. Is that the question, Ricky?
Well, it's a very complicated question. Okay, first of all, yes, you're absolutely right. Both Django is a high-budget, high-production film. It has a very high return. It's $500 million, right? And keep in mind, the studios continue to make money, right, in perpetuity. So you never really know what the return on any particular film is, right? That's just a fact. Because once they go to DVD and cable distribution, you don't see those numbers.
Right.
Blaxploitation cinema, I think, was interesting, and that's something that obviously Tarantino, going back to your statement, draws upon. So he is a craftsperson, right? He is a craftsman. He does understand the history of cinema, of U.S. cinema and popular representation. So he is drawing upon that. And that is an archive. I don't disagree that I don't think that's a bad thing per se. But here's the problem. I think that, and I think this is what we're really driving at, is that there is no infrastructure for distribution, right? So you have these waves, right? You have blaxploitation, you had Gone with the Wind, you had films like Amistad and Glory, right? All of which address, and obviously I left out the 11 for particular reasons, all of which deal with the antebellum South. But then it just tapers off. And so there's no continuation. There's nothing that gets, for example, there's no exploration that I've seen on film in terms of homosexuality in the antebellum South, right? So there isn't like this larger proliferation of diverse stories about this particular topic. And I just think that when I say we're talking about socially dead or social death, in this particular case, we're talking about the lack of the infrastructure, right? The lack of distribution, the lack of a network, which Race in Hollywood is really trying to address.
Let me just very quickly, and unfairly quickly, introduce Shana Redmond. Shana Redmond is a rock star. And I mean that. And one of the great things of knowing a rock star, especially because I could say I knew way back when, that gives me cachet. Much of my cachet on this campus and all over the country has to do with the fact that I knew Shana when she was working on prospectus for this book, and met her Upper West Side, was going to be on a committee, didn't quite work out, but she was like at Yale, way ahead of all of us, because she was thinking in transcultural and transnational terms a decade ago in ways that many of us are now trying to catch up to. And as a result of that dissertation, which became her book, which we're here to celebrate, which I hope we'll be able to get even more copies than the 9 we have. It's called Anthem, Social Movements and the Sound of Solidarity, NYU Press. She produced a masterpiece. I mean, just a few words about it. I wrote to myself, penetrating, deeply researched, brilliantly conceived, and study of how politics, collective identity, and narratives of past, present, future kind of congealed into one, travel through time and space, through music. And she has a brilliant concept of anthems as what she calls portable texts. And these portable texts advance agendas of Black social movements and Black visions of freedom. And it is a truly masterful global study that takes us to the United States, to Japan, to South Africa, to the Caribbean, to Europe, I mean all over the world. And it's amazing what you learn when you pay attention to a song that has so much meaning. I mean, a meaning where, you know, everyone knows that if you sing Lift Up Your Voice and Sing and you get to that second chorus, everyone's going to mouth the words, even if you don't know, you know, Stony the road you trod, right? But you're going to feel connected to that song. And what's so brilliant about the book is that it's not just Black people either. The way that, you know, this song gets translated into Japanese, or the way that Mary McCabe's music, or the way that Nina Simone's music, or the way that a song like Paul Robeson's Old Man River can become an anthem of Black liberation, when that was never the intention of the song. So I'm not going to say much more than that, but just enjoy this conversation, engage her. You can't leave here without getting the book, and if you run out of books, you could download it on Kindle, you could buy it through the UCLA bookstore before we give them money. You need to get this book, you need to read it, and you need to read it once, twice, 3 times, right? So, Shana Redmond.
Thank you. So thank you, Robin, for that incredibly generous and lovely introduction. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Dawn and the staff and faculty of the Bunche Center, the History Department, and Afro-American Studies for having me today. This is wonderful. I'm so excited to be here. And to talk about this work, which, as Robin insinuated or suggested, has been with me for a long time. So I begin the introduction to my book, Anthem, with this epigraph.
Okay.
Get them to sing your songs and they'll want to know who you are. Spoken to Harry Belafonte by the inimitable Paul Robeson, these words serve the project as a powerful primer by announcing the significance of song and singing to identity formations and coalition building. These are the efforts that I undertake in the book, which records Black social movements in the 20th century by following its anthems, those songs that I theorize as a set of musical forms and a set of organizing strategies. Black anthems are political thought in performance. They are dense texts that expose the negotiations at work between the West and its others, the marketplace and the commons, and the individual and the collective. Grown from the ravages of World War I, Black anthems defy the fixities of the nation and extend the solidarities of its performance throughout the globe. Indeed, these are the songs that assisted in making possible a Black world, an African diaspora, through shared ambitions and performance practices. These anthems constitute differently configured diasporic formations that link people to one another through and beyond race, into communities organized by imaginations of freedom from and an end to hierarchies of difference. Black anthems are both the rationale and the vision for these imaginations. As manifestos based in political practice and mobilization, Black anthems are able to model a three-dimensional platform for communities in struggle on a global scale. Within and between their multiple iterations, they are composed of prominent artist activists, social justice organizations, and large ground-level mobilizations by Black and allied communities who are brought into communion with one another, not simply through the assumed knowledge of their racial kinship, but instead through their daily choice to actively engage in resistance efforts. The diasporas for these anthems then are not assumed, but chosen, and speak to the lived experiences of communities under siege. While the conditions for each community and individual are particular, these songs reflect universal cadences of struggle that are dynamic and adaptable to individual communities, locations, and issues. The myriad requests to reprint and translate the NAACP's Lift Every Voice and Sing are but one example of these anthems' reach and impact beyond their communities of origin. In this respect, the diasporas of political thought and performance that I discuss are, to follow Paul Gilroy, announced more by their routes than their roots. Yet precisely their foundations in Black traditions allow their passage domestically and abroad. Neither they nor the political scenarios that they inspired can be removed from the originary knowledges and experiences and voiced through these anthems. These diasporas are held together not only by alternative and studied political visions and performance, but also by alternative sensory engagements. The song, in concert with its history and present mobilization, develops the anthemic event, which privileges hearing over seeing, another grand departure from diasporas based in race and sight. To hear the struggles of others versus the hearing of or seeing of them requires a different level of engagement with the communities represented therein. The mechanics of listening are technological as well as biological, and allow for these texts to be adopted in other national contexts where language and culture otherwise limit international communications. To hear Black anthems, whether live or on wax, is to be a part of the event itself. Singing and listening, therefore, involve pronounced political stakes within the anthemic event. In those scenes, the performing body exhibits an acknowledgement of the project taking place and the relations that made it possible. The community of performance and its environment is therefore dynamic and begins to challenge narratives of the state as an equally incorporative, undifferentiated unifying entity and the exclusive infrastructure of global power. Black anthems construct an alternative constellation of citizenship, new imagined communities that challenge the we of the democratic state, yet install new definitions of we in its place. Exposed here is a fundamental tension within the construction and use of Black anthems. They replicate certain functions of state propaganda, albeit toward different ends and with different actors. actors who historically are structurally powerless. Black anthems are the evidence of a long century of political thought and rebellion, allyship and compromise that has forever marked the struggles of aggrieved populations. The anthem, therefore, has a future, even if the nation does not. So in my brief time, I want to map for you kind of an overview of the networks developed and constructed by the sounds of modern Black social movements. I begin Anthem with after World War I with Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which produced the first Black social movement anthem of the 20th century. In the process, ushering forward a strategy adopted by other of its contemporaries and progeny. Readings of the UNIA require an immediate engagement with the tensions that underlie diasporic performances of affiliation. Gender regularly announced itself as an axis of difference within the organization, and their anthem, Ethiopia, Thou Land of Our Fathers, demonstrates how the militarized masculinity of the UNIA was enforced through the anthem. In measure 18 of the composition, men alone lead the charge to advance, advance to victory, while the women join one measure later in their collective four-part cry, Let Africa Be Free. This division and hierarchy, which privileges men at the forefront of this movement and redemption for Africa, was formalized through the anthem, setting a dangerous precedent for those that followed. While often positioned within the historiography as its polar opposite, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People learned quite a lot from the strategies of the UNIA, not the least of which being the necessity of having their own anthem. Within 7 months of the UNIA's inauguration of its Anthem of the Negro Race, the NAACP branded itself with the turn-of-the-century sounds of Lift Every Voice and Sing. Originally written to commemorate the birth of Abraham Lincoln, Lift was carried orally by Black communities for 20 years before it became the sonic mantra of an uplift mission too often premised on lauding particular class-based performances of Blackness. Those taxonomies of race and respectability were regularly challenged, however, and began to atrophy over the long history of the organization, although they are by no means dead and gone. And the anthem's performance itself throughout the 20th century served as part of that rebuttal. During the Depression, the anthem was translated into Japanese and used by strategist Yasuichi Hikita to launch a series of narratives that, alongside on-the-ground organizing by a number of cross-racial organizations, intimately connected Japan to the fates of the world's darker races. By mid-century, this coalition of peoples and nations were represented as a third world, which according to Vijay Prashad is not a place, but a project. Indeed, these communities found unique ways to mobilize their shared dispossession in service of greater camaraderie and music. And music, not surprisingly, was a central player in efforts at communication and organizing. Paul Robeson re-enters here as a performer cultivated by Negro spirituals and an activist emboldened by exchange with African workers, particularly in the port cities of the United Kingdom. His multiply revised anthem, Old Man River, is not adopted like Ethiopia or Lift Every Voice and Sing, but is instead attached to Robeson's traveling and surveilled body and made available wherever he was or needed to be. The fear of Black mobility, no less than the fear of a Black planet, hastened the development of Cold War policies of containment and exclusion, and Robeson was a test case for their effectiveness. His 1950 passport revocation did not stop his political speech, which decried racism, labor exploitation, and colonialism. It instead developed a counteraction, which manifested itself as a series of creative subversions and liberatory practices in Robeson's repertoire, including a recording of Old Man River sent in 1955 to the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. The particularities of Black labor on a global scale catalyzed much of Robeson's activism while detained in the United States during the 1950s. His work with the National Negro Labor Council, for example, continued in the types of black labor radicalism that had long sustained black workers both within and outside of organized labor. A labor battle amongst tobacco workers in Charleston, South Carolina set a compelling foundation for thinking through the role of culture in labor struggle when its primarily woman workforce went on strike in 1945. From this action developed the anthem, "We Shall Overcome," a sonic patchwork of pieces organic to the southeast coastal region and given life by the black women who refused to be divided by the assaults that they faced every day on the picket line. Though their strike only amassed modest gains, their travels with the song into Tennessee and through the Highlander Folk School propelled the local strike ballad into the mainstream of civil rights activity, in the process making black women's voices the narrative for a global movement otherwise known for and measured by what Erica Edwards has detailed as the charisma of its male leadership. Women around the country and world built on this strength, forming dense intimacies and practices of survival unique to their situations and concerns. Music, again, was a laboratory for these investments and projects, especially as the civil rights movement turned back to black power. Nina Simone epitomized this sea change through a series of songs beginning with 1964's Mississippi Goddamn, which takes to task both the dehumanizing structures of Jim Crow racism and the limiting visions of civil rights strategists, and culminating in To Be Young, Gifted, and Black in 1969. This final anthem was birthed by the political debate and love shared between Simone and playwright, essayist, activist Lorraine Hansberry, whose posthumously released play of the same name was on tour at the moment of the anthem's launch. The resonance of the phrase "to be young, gifted, and black," as well as Simone's combustible performances of black pride, made the anthem a clarion call for a new generation of black activists inspired by the decolonization of African nations, as well as the belief in the inevitability of revolution domestically. The Congress of Racial Equality, which had itself modeled the adjustment from an integrationist civil rights position to a black nationalist militancy, adopted Simone's conversion song as the Black National Anthem in 1971, announcing a definitive turn away from the histories marked by the Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, to the futures heralded by To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. The long fight against settler colonialism in South Africa, a struggle to which both Robeson and Simone spoke, slowly but surely took shape as a global preoccupation in the post-civil rights moment. Divestment campaigns, boycotts, and public condemnation buttressed the efforts of an already vibrant and mobilized diaspora of South African exiles, like Simone confidant Miriam Makeba, whose speeches before the United Nations and recordings of South African folk songs exposed both the terrors and joys of that nation. The African National Congress, which was nearly as old as the NAACP, moved to armed resistance after 1960 and began to train in countries throughout Africa. While the military wing Mkhonto we Sizwe, the MK, trained, so too did their cultural ambassador comrades, who followed Makeba and others onto stages around the globe where they performed the South African histories that the apartheid regime worked to extinguish. The ANC anthem in Nkosi Sikelel' Africa and its performance was banned in South Africa alongside the ANC, MK, Makeba, and scores of other thinkers, activists, and artists. The anthem, however, could not and would not be contained or silenced. The ANC cultural organization, Amandla, made it the centerpiece of their performances, placing it in the hearts and on the lips of their audiences from Cuba to Ghana to New Zealand. These are the anthems and movements that I track in Anthem, and a sampling of what they begin to illuminate about the African diaspora and its histories. These anthem nodes in the PowerPoint here touch one another because all of these anthems rely on the ones that preceded it. Far from working in isolation, I argue that these anthems built off of the momentum of those before them. Politically, sonically, and culturally, they expanded previous paradigms and tactics, sometimes offering correctives to the preceding anthems. Through studied engagements with prior sounds and movements, these anthems were connected within a complicated and dynamic history of liberation acts among the African descended. The knowledges and best practices developed within and between radical internationalism and Black cultural traditions were translated and transferred to global communities through these anthems, making this constellation of actors, listeners, and publics vocal, rights-holding citizens of sound. While any committed reader can decipher the what and how of Anthem, I think it also important to offer some thoughts on that question that only I can answer, which is why? Why Anthem? Well, because the universal Ethiopian anthem made citizens every single day during the life of the UNIA. Because a stranger 7,000 miles away wanted to sing with James Weldon Johnson. Because Paul Robeson's singing made him dangerous. Because the erased Black women tobacco workers in Charleston were organized labor in that city. Because Nina Simone and Lorraine Hansberry loved each other. Because Nelson Mandela was not who they tell us he was. I'm convinced more now than ever that anthems tell us a story that is not simply content with narratives of solidarity or even struggle, but seek too to show us all of the ruptures, the ugly, incomplete, and unsuccessful elements and gaps that inevitably come with social movement organizing. This is valuable information. If we are to believe in the possibility of a different future, one free from the myriad violences that mark our present, then we have to be as fluent in our complexities as we are in those things that unite us. Fundamentally, I believe, like Amiri Baraka, that the music, this is our history. I have worked diligently throughout Anthem to present that history, but writing alone cannot do it justice. Which is why it was important to me that I translate Anthem back into sound, that I return it to its sonic kinesis. In collaboration with my friend and colleague, the Dreadstar Movement, I have released Anthem, the mixtape, which is composed of the songs within Anthem, as well as those that easily make up sides B, C, and D of the movement soundscape that is barely contained within what is otherwise a healthy-sized book. This beautiful gift enlivens Anthem differently and makes possible additional imaginaries through the strategies of shared political mobilization and performance that I outline in the book. So I want to close with a few minutes of this mixtape, giving us an opportunity to return to the source so that we might recognize again who and what this music is and what it can do.
Singer causes quite a stir after performing a different version of the national anthem at the mayor's State of the City address.
Singer Renee Marie performed the song Lift Every Voice and Sing. It's also known as the Black National Anthem. No one knew her intention. After she finished, the program moved forward and the Star Spangled Banner was never performed. The incident has caused quite a stir. When I decided to sing my version, what was in my head was, I want to express how I feel about living in the United States as a Black woman, as a Black person.
Ring with a harmony. Yeah. and sings once high as the let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of love that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun on a new day begun. Never
I got into Memphis, and some began to say the threat, or talk about the threat that were out. Or what would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place.
This is an NBC News Hotline Special Report. Here's Don Hickman in Memphis.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot outside a Memphis motel this afternoon. His condition is not known at this time. Police put out a wanted bulletin for, quote, a young white male, well-dressed, who was seen running from a brick building across the street from the Lorient Hotel. Police said the assailant apparently jumped into a late model white car after the shooting and sped away.
Repeating that bulletin, Dr. Martin Luther King was shot outside a Memphis hotel this evening. His condition not immediately known, but he was taken to a hospital. Lou Wood, NBC News, New York.
Ain't gonna let nobody love tell me that, tell me that. Ain't gonna let nobody tell me that. Keep on walking, yeah, keep on talking, running, but you have to be
One, I'm really curious about, well, one, I've started reading your book, and it was like emotional for me just reading the introduction. Thank you so much for this work and this film. It makes me curious about 10 years ago, how you were drawn to this work, Anthems in particular, for especially, well, I'll just let you answer that. So how were you drawn to this work of Anthems? My second question is, have you had to defend your use of your nomenclature? So Black with a capital B versus small b, African descended versus African American. Can you talk about if that's been a conflict for you in academia, how you've dealt with it or not, and what led you to those choices?
Yeah, good questions. I was drawn to the project first just for mental health reasons. I had to find a project that I could live with, and a project that would, a project in which I didn't feel compromised, politically, socially, emotionally. And so having been a former performer and working to be a better activist, I wanted to find some project that would merge those two elements for me. And I always knew I wanted to write about Black music. I just didn't quite know in what fashion. And I actually stumbled upon the correspondence, which became the basis of Chapter 2, between James Weldon Johnson and Yasuichi Hikita in the archives at my institution. And so seeing that really sparked something for me in thinking about the anthem as its own genre within Black political organizing, Black cultural production. And it was stunning to me that it hadn't yet been fully fleshed out in the literature. So I ran with it, and thankfully I still love it to this day. It is a project that I've been able to live with. As far as the language that I use, capital B, Black, African descended, it's interesting because I had a student, I believe, ask me if I coined the term African descended, which, you know, kind of reinforced for me or signaled for me how rarely we see it used, right? I'm not original in having used it, but it's not as pervasive in the literature as maybe some would like. And I think I thought it really important actually in doing work on diaspora, in seeing and arguing as I do the connections between all of these movements and peoples and sounds, that I use language that reinforced that. So not distinguishing them by nation unless it was contextually necessary in the project. So using African descended rather than African American, or even thinking about the complexities of some of these individuals' identifications of themselves, right? So Paul Robeson identified as an African, right? Not as an African American. So it was important for me to use the language that I thought befitting of the project I was invested in, but also more reflective of the ways in which these intellectuals and artists were thinking themselves. The capital B, Black, is important to me politically, just because, you know, most other racialized groups have capital letters. Why not African descended peoples? And it was something that I flagged for my press from day one. If you have a problem with this, let me know now, because this is what I want, and never once did they give me any static. So it was really nice to have that.
And in the academy, did you get any static at all?
You know, there have been journal articles that have changed it. You know, not every publication will, you know, respect that choice. But by and large, I've not met too much difficulty in doing that.
Fabulous presentation. I really enjoyed it. So you've touched on a number of things that I find really interesting, but one in particular is this aspect of anthems as texts. The fact that they're read by people and, you know, meanings are associated with those particular readings. Now I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the ways in which these particular texts travel. That is to say, they originate in a particular historical moment for a particular group, but then maybe they're appropriated, taken up by others who may be, you know, joining the movement, or maybe have other movements that see parallels in these texts with their own experiences.
Right. So I primarily investigate their travel through performance. So I do a lot of close readings of different performances, especially with something like Old Man River that changes from year to year to year, right? And so trying to be as attentive as I can be to the dynamism of performance as the way in which these anthems are given life. Because I follow other scholars' argumentation around the orality of Black performance traditions and musical traditions, right? This is not it's not first a literate tradition amongst the African descended, right? These are pieces that are learned by ear and are carried that way. And so I do look at the sheet music for all of these pieces and do analyses of them, but I recognize that as kind of secondary evidence. The first evidence is the performance. So following those around the world has been really generative in thinking through what they mean in particular contexts, right? So how they carry the history along with them, but how they become easily adaptable at, the drop of a hat, depending on the context in which it's being performed. But then some of these anthems, like Ethiopia from the UNIA, were institutionalized through hymnal projects, right? That the UNIA had their own hymnal, that this was one of the hymns represented in it. And similarly with the NAACP, right? Whenever you go to a Black History Month event they've sponsored or one of their functions, right? The text to the anthem is always in their program, right? So that there are those types of evidences as well. So being able to recognize where these pieces appear in the literatures of the organizations. So I've done quite a bit of work in the archives of the organizations themselves to see where they appear and where they're absented, and try to read some of those scenes off of each other as a way to understand how and when the anthem was used, what was its significance, and were there moments where it was spontaneous, right? That it wasn't planned, but that it was grown from an immediate need, a spontaneous need. So the performance in combination with the sheet music and institutionalization of the literatures, those are the three primary spaces that I'm trying to track the travel of all of these pieces. And then certainly there are some elements of correspondence between the authors or iconic figures and receivers, audiences, fans.
Sure. Great presentation. I really enjoyed listening to this. And I guess I have a kind of comment, question, and then a question. I really appreciate the way you're making this intervention into recalling and reclaiming the ephemeral nature of performance. And so I guess one question would be, do you explore the discrepancy between forms of knowledge production within the text versus forms of knowledge production through the actual live performance and the kind of space, different kinds of spaces that those two processes represent? And then the other question is with regards to the practitioner-scholar divide. And have you ever run up against any pushback with regards to being a practitioner-scholar? And how do you situate yourself within that conversation, which is, I think, a larger conversation with academia and within the larger space, practitioners?
Right. Good questions. So on your first question about relating performance and its ephemerality alongside the more institutionalized resonances or existences of these anthems, I think Old Man River is a perfect example of that, right? Because I spend quite a bit of time in the introduction to the chapter setting it up through Showboat, right? And the ways in which it was intended by Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein, the authors. And then slowly piecing together all of Robeson's challenges to it, right? And it begins not with a change to the language, but in a change to the performance of that language, right? So reading moments of pause, reading moments of articulation and enunciation and emphasis within his early recordings of the song as a way to slowly track this evolution, right? That really hits, a high point during the 1930s when he's abroad and studying decolonization in African languages and working alongside dock workers and all of these things. So trying to follow that sheet music, right, that becomes a really important text for my analysis, alongside his writings, right, as he's corresponding with his accompanist in the United States, as his partner Islanda is corresponding with people about his performances and what it makes available or forecloses. And then seeing how his language changes through performance, right, because there's not any revision on a structural level to the anthem. It continues to be published as the showboat version, right, even though niggers turns to colored, turns to Negro, right, over the course of the 20th century. But his lyrical changes and his performance practice of it is never standardized in that way. And so I have to follow his singing of it to see all of those changes. But then also to try and get a sense of, it was important for me to see where he performed it in his concerts, right? Was it on the agenda for the evening? Was it in the program, or was it an unannounced encore? Or where was it situated in relation to other songs? Because early in his career, he would perform it along with a set of spirituals, right? Which also included Stephen Foster, like Old Folks at Home, you know, so you can see all of his evolution over these decades as he's really struggling with and working through all of these tensions around identity and power transnationally. So I think that that's why both of those things have to be used in concert with each other. You have to track the performance alongside the text or the tangible material, just because you see the greatest departures and tensions through those juxtapositions. As far as being a practitioner, I can't really claim to being a musical practitioner at the moment. I'm not singing very much at all. And I wish I were doing more activist work as well. So, you know, I think there has been some tension, not just due to time issues or relationships, but in regards to just different forms of knowledge, right? That I don't think about things the same way as other folks who may only have dedicated their energies to these hallowed halls. And so I think that there have been some ways in which I've had to negotiate my relationship to these institutions, my relationship to the scholarship, what the scholarship does, right? Because my investment is not, my horizon is not tenure. My horizon is justice, right? And so if I'm writing towards that and I'm performing towards that and organizing towards that, it looks very different than what other of my colleagues may be doing. So I'm always aware of that. I'm always aware of that.
Yeah, my question is also twofold, double. And like the first one is sort of related to the question about performance, actually. And I'm wondering about like the conception of citizenship that is being articulated here. And it's, you're sort of talking about it in relation to sound. And that's really important in a way because, you know, like studying philosophy and stuff, like what makes us human is that we can communicate, not that we can see. But what's problematic about that is often the discourse and deliberation is like, it's overly rational, and so other forms of communicative modes of communication are excluded. So, like, I'm just kind of wondering if you can sort of, how is enactment and performance and communication and sound, like, really articulating a different idea of citizenship than institutional, like, voting, you know, like the sort of modes that we are often engaged in. The second question is just kind of self-indulgent, but, like, how do you think of hip-hop and sort of, like, you know, of what contemporary modes of music are, and you know, specifically I'm thinking like Sujata Fernandez and like her book on sort of the hip-hop generation. Like, how do you sort of think of contemporary modes of music production?
The first question is quite difficult, so excuse me if it's not entirely articulate or robust. But part of the work of the project is to think through that question. Right, to think about the ways in which African descended people see themselves aligned with each other beyond kind of the restrictions and taxonomies of phenotype and kind of a loose conception of culture, right? And my argument is that they see each other politically first, right? That there are all of these ways in which the shared conditions of dispossession and displacement put African descended people in closer proximity to one another than kind of a racialized diaspora might necessarily suggest, right? Because there are, following Brent Edwards and other theorists, there are all of these disidentifications that are inherent in the practice of diaspora, right? And so I want to think about the ways in which political acts actually do a different type of work for thinking through solidarity, but still through this language of culture, right, which does have roots, R-O-O-T-S, right, that does have genealogies that can be traced, even if they are diffuse and difficult to navigate. So thinking about these anthems as political performances, right, as efforts at solidarity that begin to announce recognitions and solidarities beyond what we easily know of one another, right, that we see each other as similarly positioned racially. No, that we actually are arguing with each other through these performances, right, that we come together in the act of singing or even in the act of listening, right? So I argue that even some of these songs that are traditionally carried by solo voices, like To Be Young, Gifted, and Black by Nina Simone, actually become communal acts through the practice of listening, right? That we choose to attend a Nina Simone concert and we know what we're getting, right? We make an agented choice to actually be in that space and commune in certain types of ways with her and her repertoire. So that these songs actually become a choice and one that people make willingly because they recognize the project and the stakes involved in those performances. So that when I use the language citizens of sound, what I'm trying to signal is this relationship between political thought and culture, agency and kinship in a certain respect, right? That these communities are making the daily choice to actually do the work of debating with each other through these organizations and through these anthems, right? And that there's membership that's chosen rather than assumed by them. So that citizenship becomes differently articulated. They make these anthems what they need them to be. So even when the state is telling you can't vote, your body is always vulnerable to violence, right? All of these things that they're manifesting and developing alternative spaces of affiliation and safety, right? And different types of rubrics of being in the world. The UNIA was very clear about what they expected of their membership, right? That there were different types of citizenship practices that made you part of the Negro race rather than any type of citizenship constellated around the nation. So I think that these anthems are the voice of those practices and projects, those ambitions, right? And that people performing them together give us a sense of how they bought in to that project and those efforts. Your second question, I'm sorry, can you repeat it?
Yeah, I'm just kind of wondering about how you think about contemporary modes of music production,
hip-hop.
specifically hip-hop.
Right, so I actually end the book, in the conclusion I talk about Fight the Power as the last anthem of the 20th century. And it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of signaling that song, right? I don't necessarily know that it's the last anthem, but that it's a moment in which, while still pulling on these kind of flashpoint moments of the civil rights movement, all types of iconography and language that's being sampled throughout Fight the Power, that they're still advancing a different type of mobility for youth cultures in particular, right? Becoming a different type of voice for these communities. And so I think hip hop, even though it was decried by people like Nina Simone in the 1990s, actually has the potential to do the work of these earlier anthems, but it's a very different political moment. And I try to talk some about what has caused that breakdown. There's been generational misrecognition. There's been a lack of access to and investment in cultural texts in public education, right? All of these things that have led to a different culture of political possibility. And so to think about hip hop, and then I also suggest that Hip Hop by Dead Prez might be the first anthem of the 21st century. in part because it was mobilized on a structural level with the National Hip Hop Political Convention and other organizations. But that these futures are still here, that there is the possibility for these musics to actually do the work of bringing people into coalition with one another in these really dense and fantastic ways, but that we have to return to the struggle of vision. We have to fight with each other about all of these questions, and we have to be willing to sacrifice towards those ends.
This is